ready? I'm ready. Are you ready? I think David's ready.
All right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome. My name is Kevin Grout, and I'm a senior McConnell scholar here at the University of Louisville. It is my pleasure to be your host at tonight's debate, Madison versus Adams. Who is the MVP of the American founding? This is our first installment in the fall lecture series of 2015. Tonight we will begin to answer a question as old as the United States itself. We will decide who is the MVP of the American founding. But before we begin, Dr. Gregg, the director of the McConnell Center, has asked me to make a small disclaimer, and he says, quote, George Washington was clearly the MVP of the American Revolution, and so this program is somewhat misnamed, as the fight tonight is really who should come in second place behind George Washington. So thanks, Dr. Gregg. 1 year ago tonight, we met in this hall, and we allowed the rivals Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson to have their say. By a vote of the audience, Alexander Hamilton won that debate. That means whoever wins the debate tonight will meet here again 1 year from today and compete in the final round to see who is crowned the MVP of the American founding. Well, behind George Washington, of course. Now I would like to explain the format for tonight's debate. And at the end, as in a true democracy, you, the audience, will have the opportunity to select a champion. Each of our guests will begin with the positive cases of their founder, followed by each of their negative cases. At the end of the debate, our guests have agreed to take questions from the audience. Tonight we have several viewing parties going on, one at the University of the Cumberlands, and people across the nation streaming in. They will be able to participate with us by sending their questions via Twitter. If you're watching live via YouTube tonight and have questions for our professors, please tweet it to @ULMCenter. After the debate, you can take part in the voting itself by sending a tweet to @ULMCenter and using the hashtags #TeamAdams or #TeamMadison. Tonight, John Adams, second President of the United States, ambassador, leader of the Revolution, and author, will square off against James Madison, leader of the Constitutional Convention, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, and fourth President of the United States. Both of these men made important impacts on the United States and continue to do so today. But we have the opportunity tonight to decide who is more important and who deserves more credit. Making the case for #TeamAdams is R.B. Bernstein, lecturer at City College of New York's Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. He specializes in constitutional history and has written about constitutional amendments, the making of the Constitution, and the life of Thomas Jefferson. He has 2 New York Times bestsellers, and we hope his next book, entitled The Education of John Adams, will also be so well received. Making the case for #TeamMadison is Dr. David T. Konig, the professor of history and professor of law at Washington University in St. Louis. He is nationally and internationally recognized expert in Anglo-American legal history with a focus on property law, the Second Amendment, and the law of freedom and slavery. He has been a part of numerous projects to preserve and edit historical records from the Salem witch trials to Dred Scott. He is the author of several books and numerous articles, and, as I think we will see tonight, a decorated teacher. After all the ballots are submitted tonight, we will announce the winner next week on our website, mcconnellcenter.org, and on Facebook and Twitter. The McConnell Center encourages you to join in the conversation online using the tags @ULMCenter, #TeamAdams, and #TeamMadison to support your side. Now let's get down to the debate. Making the positive case for John Adams will be Professor Richard Bernstein. He will be immediately followed by Professor Konig, making the positive case for James Madison. Please welcome our debaters to their podium.
I don't know where to begin except to say that I know what John Adams would say about this. You expect me to be a craven hungerer for popularity? You expect me to beg for your votes? I will never do that. And Adams never would have done that. Adams was a man who, although he was a skilled legislator and shrewd politician, was an honest man, sometimes too honest on occasion. His great partner and rival in diplomacy, Benjamin Franklin, once wrote to Congress in words that have skewered poor old Adams ever since, "Mr. Adams is always an honest man, often a wise one, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses." Adams cared deeply, which is why Franklin mistook that for being out of his senses. He cared deeply about constitutionalism, the idea that you can create a government that is both empowered by and restrained by a system of government, a constitution. He was perhaps obsessed by constitutions. One of the central themes of his career, as I'm learning and trying to teach in the book that I'm writing now, is that Adams was fascinated by constitutions, ancient, medieval, and modern, in all places in the Western world. Wherever he could learn about a constitution, he would dig into it and try to assimilate it into what he knew, and then try to educate posterity. He would call them "you people," about what he learned. Adams was not at the Federal Convention of 1787. He did not have a direct hand in the making of the Constitution. In that respect, I suppose, the man represented by my learned colleague and friend would seem to have an edge. But let's look at context. That's what I'm going to urge you to do. Think about context. John Adams was the absent framer. He began his career in public service as a constitutional advocate, an advocate combating what he saw as British tyranny, British negation of Americans' English rights under the unwritten English Constitution. And he urged his countrymen what he always did. The quotation that's on the publicity flyer for this event: "Let us dare to read, think, speak, and write." And notice that Adams always put reading first. Adams was a profound student of English constitutional history and constitutional law. He swiftly emerged in Massachusetts as the leading legal advocate of the Americans' case against British policy, what he called British tyranny. He did that for over a decade, allowing it to cut into his law practice, allowing it to sap his commitment to his wife and family, whom he loved very dearly. He even, out of devotion to constitutional and legal principle, did something that seemed to cut against his constitutional advocacy for America and against British tyranny. As you know, he, with young Josiah Quincy, were the lawyers for the British soldiers accused of murder in the Boston Massacre. And he managed to get 6 of the defendants acquitted and 2 of them convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. Why? All his life, Adams explained that the right of counsel is one of the most important of English constitutional liberties, and sooner than see these men go unrepresented, he would take the case himself. That is a man of principle. And by the way, when he was doing that, James Madison was 15 years old. So even length of service, one would suggest that Adams is an extraordinarily important player in the Anglo-American constitutional story. Now, when things in 1775 and 1776 looked so hopeless that Americans realized, oh my God, we're going to have to leave. We may have to leave the British Empire. We may have to turn our backs on a king whose coronation we welcomed in 1760 with cries of joy, in which we told him that his most loyal subjects were the inhabitants of British North America. We're going to have to turn our backs on him. But what comes after that? What comes after that is, what kind of government are we to have? And John Adams swiftly emerged as one of the leading spirits in figuring out what the American solution to the problem of creating new legitimate government would be. He kept getting letters all through late 75 and early 76 from friends and former colleagues from the First Congress and Second Continental Congress all over the colonies. What are we to do? In God's name, what are we to do? How should it look? Excuse me. How should it look? Should we write something? What should it contain? How should it look? What institutions should it have? What should we do? And over and over and over again, Adams wrote letters. And finally, he got sick and tired of writing the same letter over and over and over again. And as he put it in a letter to a friend, I chose to borrow a little time from my sleep. And he wrote a pamphlet called Thoughts on Government, which, if he had dropped dead the minute that pamphlet hit the press, he'd still be remembered, because that pamphlet is an amazing guide to how to write a constitution, what it should contain, what principles, what institutions. And in that pamphlet, and I hope you'll forgive me, I seem to have lost my reading glasses, so I'm going to try to read anyway. I want to read something to you that John Adams wrote about this. You and I, my dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would have wished to have lived. How few of the human race have ever enjoyed an opportunity of making an election of government more than of air, soil, or climate for themselves or their children, when before the present epoch had 3 millions of people full power and a fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest government that human wisdom can contrive. See, for John Adams, this was not just something that scared people. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Adams had an idea of what to do and how it might matter. Matter for Americans in his lifetime, matter for the rest of the world as a model for emulation, and matter for posterity. In fact, 1.5 years after he wrote this pamphlet, he wrote a letter to his wife Abigail, complaining bitterly about having to serve in Congress when he wanted nothing more than to be at home with his wife and his children. And then he addressed you. Posterity, he said, you will never know how much it has cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you make a good use of it. If you do not, I shall repent in heaven that I ever took half the pains to preserve it. He meant it. He really meant it. This was really important to him because he saw that not only was this an event specific to America, he saw that this was a piece of one of the greatest movements for liberty, education, justice, reason in human history, the transatlantic Enlightenment. And Americans' contributions to that transatlantic Enlightenment would be forms and models of government and politics. And Adams was a central player in that endeavor. In one of the greatest things he did, he ended his time as an American diplomat, which he found incredibly frustrating, for reasons I can go into later if you like. And he went back home to Massachusetts, discovered almost immediately that he'd been elected to a new kind of meeting, a constitutional convention. Now, Adams cannot claim to have invented the convention, and he didn't. But he, excuse me, he ended up playing the central role in that body. He was named one member of the 3-member drafting committee, and there were hundreds of delegates to this convention in Massachusetts. And this drafting committee named him as a subcommittee. And Adams prepared the groundwork for what we now know as the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. Most historians agree that it is the most eloquent of the state constitutions, and it was the leading example among the state constitutions that delegates to another convention 7 years later drew on for framing a new form of government, the Federal Convention framing the United States Constitution. So if we give Mr. Madison and his colleagues credit for creating the Constitution, they didn't spin it out of thin air. They had something to work with. Now, I have 5 minutes, I believe, so I will quickly summarize certain things that we have to acknowledge. Even after the U.S. Constitution was created, Adams played central roles in the process of making that document mean something. And it's sad because his roles were painful and difficult. And the only way I can sum them up as, he was a constitutional guinea pig. He was the first vice president of the United States, an office that had no model anywhere. And Adams was frustrated by it, alarmed by it, scared by it. In the first Congress in 1789, at one point, he said, "Gentlemen, I pray you, gentlemen," he's talking to the rest of the Senate, "tell me what I shall be." Nobody knew. Nobody knew what the vice president was to be. And Adams suffered as he tried to make that institution mean something. And he often guessed wrong because there was no guidance for him. After 8 years in that office, and Gary Wills once referred to all holders of the vice presidency as the office's victims. Not until modern times have we figured out what to do with the vice presidency. We can talk about that later if you like. Adams again becomes a guinea pig, but it's a different kind of guinea pig. Now it's, how do you be president following George Washington? George Washington was our first president, as we all know. He put his stamp on the office. His conduct, his demeanor, his words, everything he did. He himself said that. "I walk on untrodden ground," he said. "Every act or failure to act that I take will have precedential value." So if you have 8 years of George Washington as president to follow, what do? Poor John Adams thought he had to be just like George Washington. But he was incapable of it. Because they were two different men with two different personalities, two different backgrounds, two different kinds of training, and Adams suffered for it. Only in the last year of his presidency, after Washington died, did John Adams dare to try to make the presidency something modeled on his own strengths and weaknesses. And although he did great service to his country, saving it from an undeclared war with France, and in some ways even more important, consenting to his own defeat at the polls and not trying to hold on to the office, but stepping down. That may have been certainly one of Adams' two greatest services to the country as president and to the constitutional system. He did have one other great service, although Mr. Madison would probably disagree. Adams appointed the greatest Chief Justice the United States has ever seen, John Marshall. And so if we value John Marshall as the great Chief Justice, and we value Marshall's achievements in developing and exploring concepts of judicial review, national supremacy, federal regulation of interstate commerce, maybe we have John Adams to thank for that as well. So, you see a pretty distinguished record of achievement, going beyond a more formal involvement with the framing and defense of the Constitution. And there's one last thing to say about John Adams. He lived 25 years as a former president of the United States. And in that task, in that role, and in the task as one of the last surviving founding fathers, he did his dangdest to shape Americans' perceptions of the history that he and his colleagues made, which went to the history of the constitutional system. So I submit to you that the case for John Adams is formidable. I'm just curious what my learned brother has to say about that. I yield up the balance of my time.
I would like to channel Mr. Madison a bit here, speak in his voice to recapture the realities of, are we doing okay on the sound? It's a little feedback? Okay. In order to recapture the context, I exasperate my students by having them write one of their papers longhand using a 40-watt bulb as the only illumination to replicate a candle. So, what follows is Jimmy Madison. I want to welcome my learned, very learned, esteemed colleague to Virginia, here to the Kentucky District of Virginia. It's nice to have someone who doesn't tower over me as my Virginia colleagues do. But I'm also rather not as skilled a public speaker as many, and I would like to read, for the most part, what my comments have been in the creation of the American Constitution at the convention and in its ratification. First, I think there's much that I agree with Mr. Adams. In fact, we probably agree on much more than we disagree. Absolutely. And on these vital questions, we have little disagreement. We agree that governments are instituted to preserve domestic peace and assure external security. We agree that constitutions should be written, which is a controversial idea. We agree that constitutions should be constructed as to bring the most talented and virtuous men into government. I apologize to Abigail, who wanted us to remember the ladies, but we are in the 18th century, after all. We fundamentally need, and this I think is something that must be very, very heavily emphasized, on the imperfections of human nature that are hurdles to the creation of governments. We agree that the science of government requires us to base our ideas about government on the science of mankind. And that science of mankind requires us to recognize the imperfections of humankind. I'm sure you would agree with me in my statement in the 51st number of the Federalist Papers, which I wrote along with Mr. Hamilton and Mr. Jay. If men were...
I understand why you did that. I'll never understand.
They needed an outsider. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige the government to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on government. But experience has taught us the need for auxiliary precautions. Our disagreement is what these auxiliary precautions should be. I must recall what I wrote in other numbers of the Federalist, that I took particular notice of what I received in correspondence from all over our new nation. Alarming reports from the new states about the internal difficulties and the vices of their own state political systems. I have been told that our governments, as they tell me, and I quote, are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflict of rival parties, and that measures are often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. I will say it again, these must be chiefly, if not wholly, the effects of the unsteadiness and injustice with a factious spirit has tainted our public administrations. Popular government is on trial. It is on trial, and the American experiment must succeed as the Tories of England and the crowned heads of Europe wish us to fail. The struggles of the war years and the decade that followed showed us how our experiments in Republican governments have produced many unhappy surprises that force us to reconsider what the ancients have taught us and what some of our most distinguished philosophers maintain to this day. Some authorities, especially the ancients and more recently Baron de Montesquieu, have posited that a free democracy can only thrive in a small geographical area, where the uniformity of belief and opinion will produce a pure democracy of equal individuals, perfectly equalized, they say, and assimilated in their possessions and in their opinions and in their passions. This small polity, he argues, allows direct democracy. At the opposite end of the spectrum, he argues, and many of our philosophers believe this, a vast nation such as our own, which stretches hundreds of miles from north to south, hundreds of miles from east to west, can only be ruled, as the past has shown, by a dictator capable of imposing order on distant and unruly subjects, as in the Russian Empire of the Tsars. Every form of government, we must acknowledge, has its dangers. And as I wrote to Mr. Jefferson, an ardent disciple of the Baron Montesquieu, who was in Paris absorbing French philosophy and French wine while we deliberated our federal constitution in Philadelphia, a democratic republic has its own particular pathologies. A danger that a majority may become tyrannical. A tyranny, we might say, as some say, of the majority. Wherever the real power in government lies, I wrote, there is the danger of oppression. Instead, the problem is not just the structure of government, but in our government, the real power lies in the majority of the community. And in the invasion of private rights is chiefly to be apprehended, not from acts of the government contrary to the sense of its constituents, but from acts in which the government is the mere instrument of the major number of its constituents. This is the peculiar disease of democracy. And a government whose authority is limited to a small geographical area is not the Republican democratic remedy we need. What I propose, I call an extended republic, in which we behold a Republican remedy for Republican diseases, not monarchical remedies for monarchical diseases. Let us look at what the cause of these diseases are, these Republican diseases. It is faction, sir. It is faction, party passion. And what do I mean by that? Well, as I wrote, by a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or even a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some of their own common impulse or passion adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. But how do we cure these mischiefs of faction? We must recognize that the spirit of self-interest, even at the expense of others, is part of our human nature. We cannot escape human nature. It is sown in our human nature. And we could try one of two things to cope with this. We could try to remove the causes of faction, or we could try to control its effects. Now, I don't think we can remove its causes. These are too deeply ingrained, and if we were to try to, the cure would be worse than the disease. We could destroy the liberty of expression and freedom of action, which creates faction and leads to self-interest. Or we could try to impose the same opinions on all of our citizens. Neither of these is acceptable, because the latent causes of faction are too deeply sown in the nature of man. Competing interests, as I wrote, have divided mankind into parties, inflamed them with mutual animosities, and rendered them much more disposed to vex and oppress each other than to cooperate for their common good. What has been the cause of such faction? Well, the ancients have talked about the unequal distribution of property, rich against poor. And I think that that will always be with us. That is another thing that the unequal capacities of human beings will always produce. But as I prefer to describe it, it is not just the unequal distribution of property. It is the various distribution of different types of property. Various and different types of property, even if property were equally distributed among all, it would be of a different sort for different people. Our nation is especially prone to this, our variegated nation. The fisherman of New England shares little in common with the cultivator of tobacco in Virginia. The mercantile investor of Philadelphia has little in common with the hunter of Kentucky. What sets them against one another is the clash of competing outlook interest, and this leads to a factional splintering of the body politic. But this is not the result of the vastness of our country. In Massachusetts, Western farmers, led by Daniel Shays, rose up and shut down the government when the mercantile interests in Boston refused to acknowledge their economic distress and instead threw yet heavier tax burdens and debt burdens upon them. In our own state of Virginia, settlers here in the Western District of Kentucky chafe at the rule by the Tidewater tobacco planters. The clash of interests we see occurring in many other states is the same. Property is not secure if those in control of government can throw the burden of taxation onto others. Every opportunity, every shilling with which they overburden the inferior number is a shilling saved to their own pockets. And as I emphasized there, it's not rich against poor. In Massachusetts, those who were rallying behind Captain Shays were some very wealthy farmers. Let us look at that bedlam of politics. Bedlam of all our new states, the bedlam of politics is in Rhode Island. A small state. One would assume under the Republican model of Baron Montesquieu, it would be ideal for democracy. But it can little be doubted that if Rhode Island took itself out of our union, out of our confederacy, and was left to itself, the insecurity of rights in Rhode Island under the popular form of government within such narrow limits would be displayed by reiterated oppressions of factious majorities, that some power altogether independent of the people, we call this a constitution, would soon be called for by the voice of the very factions whose misrule had proved the necessity of it. In an extended republic of the United States, and among the many variety of interests that we have, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice and the general good. The common good is more than just the sum of individual goals. It exists independently of special interest, and we must seek by this extended republic, as the Federalist 10th number says, to bring in as many competing factions as possible, to have them counteract ambition. Ambition will counteract ambition, but at the same time, it is hoped it will elevate their political discourse to recognize what they all have to agree on, that their special interests are intimately blended and interwoven with one another. So I propose that we reject Baron Montesquieu's model of the small republic. Instead, we have a larger republic where the population can provide us a larger pool of talented individuals. It will be much more difficult for the unworthy candidate to corrupt with the vicious arts of deception these elections. The smaller the society, the fewer will be the distinct parties and the greatest danger of a majority coalition. So you must extend the sphere and take in a greater variety of parties and interests. A faction may succeed in a particular state, but it will be unable to spread its general conflagration to the other states. A religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in one part of our confederacy, but the variety of religious sects that we have encouraged to thrive and compete with one another, dispersed over the entire face of our nation, must secure the national councils against that. We may say the same of economic special interest or any other wicked project. So an establishment by majority, an established religion by majority, serves only to compel faith and to stunt freedom of religion. Is that a 1 or 5? Time, okay. We can never expect our society to be uniform, but we can try to overcome our narrow special interests. As democracy is at once our promise and our threat. And I share with you, Mr. Adams, that an excess of a good thing can be dangerous. As stewards of this experiment, we have to go beyond the ideas of the past, of rich against poor, and move to new science of politics. Our extended republic, I hope, can put that into action.
Professor Bernstein will now offer a negative case against James Madison, followed by Professor Konig offering his negative case against John Adams. They'll each have 10 minutes.
Many years ago, Mr. Madison, Dean Swift, Jonathan Swift, you may remember, wrote a book called Gulliver's Travels. And in that book, in part 3 of that book, he refers to the projectors of Laputa, people who have projects and who project visions of ideals. And of course, the account that he gives of these projects and these visions is deeply satirical and mocking. I do not wish to mock you, sir. I do not. I respect you, though you are a young man.
Young whippersnapper.
Yes. I gather that's what you say in Virginia. But you overlook a central lesson of the past. You say, let us discard the wisdom of the past for this new wisdom. I don't understand. Why should we discard the lessons of the past when the past gives ample evidence that those lessons are sound? Human nature, integral to human nature, is the passion for distinction. In some people, that passion for distinction takes the form of a lust for supreme political power, the monarchic principle. In others, it gives rise to an ambition to succeed, to be one of the people who runs the show, as they say in New York. The aristocratic principle. All of human history teaches that these things are true. Pick any 50 people. Pick these people. Put them on a desert island. Give all of them an equal share of resources, an equal share of money, gold and silver perhaps. At the end of 1 year, do you know what you will find? You will find 25 of them with all the money and 25 without. Aristocracy emerges. An aristocrat is any person who can command by whatever means at least one vote beside his own. All of history teaches this. You yourself acknowledge it when you discuss various sources of factional conflict and you cite attachment to one or another political leader. That was Patrick Henry, was it not?
Lamented Patrick Henry.
The lamentable Patrick Henry, you would say, I'm sure. But the thing is this. Your project doesn't make sense. You know why it doesn't make sense, Mr. Madison? I believe your friend Hamilton told you this. When he heard you give this talk at the Federal Convention, you draw the people from all over the globe, but they will meet in one room. And if they meet in one room, then your factions will emerge. Your factions will prevail. And you had to acknowledge that he was right, which is why you wrote that other essay, number 51, about ambition. Because your extended republic doesn't quite achieve what you say it will. I don't like to say these things. I really don't. But I must in the cause of truth and honesty in political discourse. You had a great political career, Mr. Madison. You were one of the greatest of us. But I cannot put by me the idea that you just are proposing a new political science without any brief for or consideration of or even the gentlest of nods to the old political science. Your new political science does not require throwing away the old. In fact, Mr. Madison, I would submit to you that our political ideas might fit together as projects, good projects, to preserve constitutional government against the forces that would destroy it. You think horizontally. You stretch elastic with this extended republic. I've heard many republics. There are monarchic republics like Great Britain. There are aristocratic republics like Venice. There are democratic republics like our supposed United States. I've never heard of an extended republic. Fine. I know there are as many republics as there are people who write about them. But your extended republic only solves certain kinds of problems, if it does, which I'm not quite convinced that it does. But you must, in designing a republic, acknowledge the existence of that human nature-grounded passion for distinction. I submit that in addition to a horizontal dimension of constitutional design, you must have a vertical one that recognizes the old classical orders in political thought: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, the one, the few, the many. But if you fit that recognition, which means crafting institutions both to make room for those aspects of human nature and to safeguard against their abuses by checks and balances, you fit that with your extended republic. And perhaps then we have a true American formula for preserving Republican governments against the dangers of its abuses. I wonder what you think of that, sir.
Mr. Adams, we are in your debt, as you call yourself a constitution monger, someone who creates constitutions.
I try.
But the transition from the theoretic formulations that you have given us and the actual applications, when we see your system put into effect, this notion of, rather than a horizontally constituted body politic.
Not rather than, in addition to.
Yet in its formulation, we see that that the emphasis on the verticality is the predominant active force here. And we see this, for example, and I think, in all due respects, we all reflect our upbringing. You developed your ideas on constitution building by watching the impoverished mobs in the streets of Boston and the need.
You've never been to Boston, Mr. Madison. You would not say so.
What I read in the paper of the tarring and feathering and the smashing of buildings and tearing down the governor's home. I mean, this strikes me as a form of something that would condition many sensible men and women into fearing the power of the mob and the need to overawe, which is the term that recurs very often in your writing, the need to overawe the common people. And I think that we must really, and I can understand that, your Puritan ancestors and their view of human life, that only a small number of the elect and the saved must rule over the benighted, unsaved masses.
You're pleased to be very amusing.
I can understand your. I admire how you try to at least overcome your upbringing in this by adding to it this other dimension. And I think you're correct in having no illusions about human nature. Truly, your memories of the mob and of your time in London, I think, have conditioned you to think this way. But your solutions, I think, take too dismal a view of humanity, a little farther than I would want to do it myself. You've received a great deal of criticism, as you know, and I think much of it unwarranted, for your campaign to confer titles upon our elected officials.
You were one of the severest critics of that campaign, Mr. Madison. It seems odd that you think that the criticism I got was somewhat unwarranted when you were might and main laboring at it.
I would think, however, that I have far more serious critics in mind. Mr. Jefferson, who called it the most superbly, absurd idea that I have ever heard. That's Mr. Jefferson, and he does, like all great men, you and I included, sometimes speak in exaggerated and broad terms. But to suggest that the President of the United States be referred to as His Highness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties.
It was actually His High Mightiness, if you must quote the title
Well,
correctly.
the committee toned it down into His Highness, and then the governor of Massachusetts being His Majesty.
His Excellency.
His Excellency, although your personal preference was Majesty first, and then again you yielded to less. Let us go beyond that. But to be fair, I know what you were trying to do. Your fear and distrust of an aristocracy makes it imperative in your constitutional system for a very strong executive to balance this aristocracy. And we can sympathize with that. And as you have rightly told Mr. Jefferson, you, Mr. Jefferson, fear monarchy, I fear aristocracy.
Yes.
But this led Jefferson, again, to sputter. Can anyone read Mr. Adams's defense of the American Constitution without seeing that he was a monarchist? And I would not go so far, but I think the effort to create a government...
Ah, the old charge, isn't it? The old charge. You know, I don't understand it. If I were a doctor and I wrote a book about smallpox, am I a man wanting to spread an epidemic? I don't think so. If I write a book about Julius Caesar, does that mean I want a Roman emperor? I don't think so. This is ridiculous.
But I wouldn't write a medical book based on earth, air, fire, and water either. The old principles altogether.
So you attempt that analogy, do you?
So I think we must go beyond these older ideas. As you wrote, you yourself wrote to our famous doctor, Dr. Rush, you doubt whether titles overawe and say that this doesn't exist in the United States. I am almost disposed to answer you, as you said to Dr. Rush, Boston, New York, Philadelphia. I don't believe it would be possible to support any government at all among such multitudes without distinctions of rank and titles that mark them. So my objection is to...
You don't understand, do you?
No, I don't.
You don't
I
understand. Maybe these good people
We'll get back.
understand.
You'll have your time to respond. For example, your
It's painful.
distrust
It's like
of
listening to a trial of colors by a blind man.
your statement that where annual elections end, tyranny begins.
It's an old English constitutional principle. You say
Emphasize the word old. And emphasize the word old, because I would submit, as I've written against it in the Federalist, number 53, that this is an arbitrary period, 1 year. Rhode Island and Connecticut have every 6 months elections. They are veritable political bedlams because of this. So I believe your loyalty to the past, your vast erudition and learning, which are beyond compare, really beyond compare, I think prevent you from embracing fully the need to create a new constitutional order. We must be skeptical of those who argue that our governments must intervene and promote religion, as the Constitution of Massachusetts does. Does it not? It does.
The Constitution of Massachusetts does that because from time immemorial we had a religious establishment. And when you have a religious establishment, the Constitution maker is constrained to work within that religious establishment because the sentiments of the people he represents will not allow him to do otherwise.
I believe the sentiments of a minority of the people may insist that they do otherwise.
In a future generation, perhaps, the disestablishment may come.
I believe it has come in Virginia, at my pen, at the urging of my pen.
That's because the Church of England in Virginia was one of the most corrupt religious institutions known to a disbelieving world.
And is not the standing order in Massachusetts much better than this? I would dare say it is not. In fact, as my friend Jefferson says, New England is more aristocratic than Virginia because that has this inherited aristocracy called the clergy, whose sons follow their fathers.
You have your Lees, your Madisons, your Jeffersons, your Randolphs, your Washingtons, your Ludlows. I could go on and on and on.
You could.
And Mr. Jefferson, when I tried to tell him that, just wouldn't hear of it. No, we have no aristocracy in Virginia.
But they are not
Ladies and
aristocrats.
gentlemen, all I have to do is say the name Randolph.
Or if we are serious about religion and its importance in our society, if we are serious about it, how can we inquire and seek religious truth if we have not made up our minds and must pay taxes to the government to tell us how to make up our minds about religion? That, I would submit, is a fatal flaw. Eve, how should we be true to our Creator if we pay money to a government-supported church? That I still do not understand. And in fact, I think the notion that more and more religious sects, where people who have not yet made up their minds can pray and express their faith, will be better for religion than telling someone what religious truth is.
You are agile, Mr. Madison. You are agile.
I'm little.
You
I'm
have skipped from the subject that we should be talking about to the subjects that you particularly want to talk about.
This is a constitutional issue, is it not? I'm small, but I'm quick. So,
I still can romp with some agility, Mr. Madison. But
we must recognize that we can't create our view of government on the view of urban mobs, where, for example, the Patriots of Boston reject the rule of the rule of law in their competitions.
And this didn't
The rule of ball, get it?
This didn't
The
happen
Patriots of Boston, get it? Right. Okay.
Oh, I see. You are pleased to pun, Mr. Madison.
I admit-
I know you were prone to that as a young man.
It is the lowest form of humor, I admit,
Yes.
but
But let me...
but in conclusion, I must say that, that I admire your courage. I admire your courage when you would write the defense of the Constitutions and say, this book will make me unpopular.
Of course it did. It did.
But there are
Because I
reasons.
told the truth, damn it.
So there are reasons for that unpopularity, because I think of its view of the mass of the people. This is the case. So I will conclude at that point.
Thank you both. Thank you both. You've given us both a lot to think about and a lot of questions to ask. So now we're going to move into about 30 minutes of a question and answer period. If you're watching remotely, please remember you can join in the questions too on Twitter using @ULMCenter. And you can ask your question that way. If you're in the audience, please raise your hand, and Jacob and I will be around with a microphone to ask your question. In respect to time, please ask your question as succinctly as possible. And I think Jacob will have the first question from Twitter.
This first question comes from Twitter from Big Liberty. And the question is, can the speakers discuss the role of Adams' defense of the Constitution and Madison's rejection of the work?
Well, we have been doing that already, I think. Poor Mr. Madison. He wrote to Mr. Jefferson. It's one of the... If I had known about this review at the time, I would have been tempted to hang myself. He wrote to Mr. Jefferson, "Men of learning finds nothing new in it. Men of taste, many things to criticize. And men without either, not a few things that they will not understand." Thanks a lot.
Well,
You didn't understand my book because it didn't contain what you were looking for. You were looking for someone addressing the extended republic. And I was talking about a central truth of human history that you choose to regard as outmoded. Now, Mr. Madison, we are both old now. We have to face that fact.
a couple hundred
Does
years
that
old.
mean that this audience just throw us both away because we're old?
No, but
Does old wisdom amount to nothing? I'm not saying that old wisdom should occupy the field, should preempt what's new. In fact, in the defense, I say at the beginning how regrettable it is that we've had no great innovations in constitutional thought comparable to innovations in human knowledge of natural philosophy, what later generations will call science, and technology. What I said in that book was, I wish I could write about some new innovations, but I don't see any on the stage. I will have to talk about some old things that we're in danger of throwing away. Now, The extended republic, I tried to show you how the extended republic could fit with the old learning I was seeking to defend. You transmogrified that case with adept skill that a certain real estate mogul in future ages might envy.
I too was trained as a lawyer. I too was trained as a lawyer, Mr. Adams.
But you
must recognize.
transmogrified the point. I was trying to fit your ideas and my ideas together. You insist on a choice.
Well, there's a core of belief, experiment in the freedom of the individual mind that I think is seen in the support for an absolute freedom of religion and no establishment of religion, which is a constitutional issue. But I'd also bring up the issue that that has never been tried before, because of the old idea of seditious libel, is that criticism of the government reduces the respect that we have for individuals, and that these people should be prosecuted for seditious libel for basically just lowering the respect we have for a political officer, even if that charge is true. Now, this is an ancient verity of English common law that I would repudiate completely. And I think you should have repudiated by refusing to sign the Sedition Act in 1798.
I will prove my reputation for honesty to you, Mr. Madison. I bitterly regret that law. At the time, and this does not excuse anything, I was skeptical about it. I was uncertain of it. Even my rather bitterest critic, Alexander Hamilton, heard of the law and said, let us not establish a tyranny. But you have to remember, the government was new. The government was fragile. The government's support rested principally upon the characters and reputations of those holding office under it. I should point out to you that your vaunted friend, Mr. Jefferson, who was unremitting in his censure of me for that statute, also signed it as vice president. I should also point out to you that Mr. Jefferson, after the statute expired, worked with Governors Clinton of New York and McKeon of Pennsylvania to conduct what he called a few wholesome prosecutions of Federalist newspaper editors using the state common law. Now, you're not going to expect this, I know, Mr. Madison. But Mr. Jefferson told me when we were in retirement that you had a book in your library containing editorials denouncing you, calling you names, libeling you, slandering you. And I said in response, oh, I wish I had had the foresight to make such a book for myself.
Of me? Criticisms of Mr. Jefferson or of yourself?
Of yourself, sir. I would have wanted such a book of the criticisms of myself. But I also told Mr. Jefferson that I admired your restraint in not proceeding against any of these critics, and I still do.
Mr. Jefferson reluctantly refused to prosecute because they were true. The accusations were true, and he believed the truth.
He did prosecute!
But the prosecutions were dropped.
No, they were not.
No one was convicted.
People of New York versus Harry Croswell, 1804, argued by your friend, Mr.
Hamilton. That's right.
And who argued for liberty of the press.
Right.
And Chancellor Kent ruled for Hamilton's argument. Croswell was acquitted. Mm-hmm. So there was at least one case that Mr. Jefferson did not drop. It got dropped on him by a Federalist judge. Oh, Mr. Madison, you are better at the facts than this.
I believe Mr. Adams did not carefully read the cases in Connecticut where truth was being raised as a defense, and it was believed that truth must be allowed as a defense, contrary to your notion of seditious libel. The truth is not a defense.
And as I said, I regret that. I've already conceded the point. You are simply seeking to make the rubble bounce, to entertain yourself.
Oh, is it not sweet to do so?
It's not good argument. But then you never practiced law. It's true, he never practiced law.
Well, with great satisfaction. True. that I didn't do so. But
Indeed. There are other people who had questions. This gentleman in the red shirt here had his hand up.
You alluded to the vice president. What did Adams try to do as vice president, and how do you see that things have finally settled out for the vice presidency?
Adams thought a great many men, including the learned figure to my right, thought that the office he held would make him, in fact, the prime minister of the administration of the government. Mr. Madison, as leader of the House of Representatives, thought he was going to be prime minister. Mr. Jefferson, as Secretary of State, thought he was going to be prime minister. Mr. Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, thought he was going to be prime minister. And I, as vice president, president of the Senate, thought perhaps I should be prime minister. So I tried to lead the Senate. They would not be led. It was like herding cats. I tried to educate them about what I had learned in Europe about government. They didn't want to hear it. They made very clear to me that what I was supposed to do was sit and preside and keep my mouth shut. And I did so, because I recognized that that was the role they intended for me. The vice presidency, as I held it, was an onerous, frustrating office. Many years, nearly centuries after my time, beginning with a gentleman named Eisenhower, working with his vice president, a young fellow named Nixon. And then we move forward to a president named Carter, working with a vice president named Mondale, a president named Reagan, working with a vice president named Bush, and on to the present. The president has used the vice president as a kind of administrative gadfly through the administration, someone who has a brief to look at whatever issue attracts his attention and discuss it with the president and perhaps assume leadership in defining the policy pertaining to that issue. Vice presidents in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s and 2000s, with one notable horrible exception, have performed valuable roles in our government. That horrible exception came as close as anything anyone has ever seen to defining the monarchic specter that most of my colleagues were against. But that's the answer. I mean, I found the vice presidency a horrible, frustrating job. And if I could talk to a young journalist of your time named Gary Wills, I would shake his hand for referring to vice presidents as the office's victims. I was the first.
Yet, when the Sedition Act came to your office as president to sign, it allowed vicious criticisms of the vice president. It prosecuted criticisms of the president, the justices of the Supreme Court, and other members, but it rather cleverly, somehow unaccountably, left out criticism of Mr. Jefferson as vice president.
Given how unimportant the vice presidency turned out to be when it was entrusted to me, that makes perfect sense, doesn't it?
But to get back to our question about my defense of the Constitution, as I wrote in the Federalist, which was urging the ratification of the Constitution in New York, the specter of political horror stories that are thrown up against new things, for example, the criticism of the federal Constitution that the Constitution did not protect against relocating the capital of the United States to Peking, China, I think is a little bit over the top, and I think is emblematic of the fear of change that many have in the United States. I think, as I wrote in Federalist 37, human language is imperfect. Even when the Almighty speaks to us, we disagree with what the Almighty is saying to us.
That's almost blasphemous, Mr. Madison. Even God cannot use human language. That's what you're saying.
That's what I am saying. Yes.
Good heavens.
Well, that's what this
We never talk that way in Massachusetts.
That's what freedom of religious faith entitles us to say. So
My
I think
God.
I think that the fear of innovation and of striking to a more creative acknowledgement that the situation in the United States is a new novus ordo seclorum, calls for new political arrangements and solutions. And I think that the extended republic of acknowledging the variety of human passions and interests at work against one another puts ambition against ambition and is best designed to prevent one group from gaining control of the government.
Modern critics would say to you that all you've done is create one large theater for faction, and especially as changes in communication and information technology take place, drawing the states together and drawing the people together into one unit, you will have factions that threaten to tear the republic apart.
Now, Mr.
So what have you done
Adams,
to
am I
us?
hearing you correctly? You are predicting the future? Now, in Massachusetts, people were hanged as witches for doing that.
No, they were not.
They
were hanged.
Hanged as witches.
They were hanged as witches for other reasons. You should know better than that.
Clairvoyance would have qualified them for the noose, as your ancestors were so gleefully.
You should have practiced law. You know why? It would teach you to make better arguments.
Well, as my friend Mr. Jefferson said, lawyers are taught to speak endlessly and foment division and charge by the hour. Guilty as charged. And further deponent saith not. Any other questions?
Any other questions? Sure, there must be other questions.
This woman here.
Was there always this division? Was there always a division between New England and Virginia as far as the constitutional?
From day one, there was division. From the time John Smith came to Virginia, he noticed the difference between the two. And as Mr. Adams would sneeringly say,
I do not sneer, Mr. Madison.
well, do you huff?
I grumble a bit.
Sputter?
Yes, I do
a lot of
sputter on
sputtering,
occasion
right.
when having to deal with substitutes for argument.
The difference is profound, and this was seen as perhaps even a barrier to a successful union. In fact, the great fear wasn't necessarily that the Union would split into 13 different republics, but 3 regional republics, New England, the middle states now, and the South, and that this would be the great danger to the United States. And it's the reconciliation of these competing interests that I think the extended republic is designed to prevent, to unify these various and different parts of our union so that they will not be separate and go to war with one another.
Besides, if you look at the group of people called the Founding Fathers, they were divided amongst themselves on practically any issue you care to name. It's one of the problems. I gather there are judges in your time who quest unceasingly for original intent, meaning, or understanding, for the Founders' Council, for the plain meaning understanding of the Constitution as of 1787, and they forget. Your own delegation in the Federal Convention was riven by division, was it not?
Absolutely.
New York's delegation was riven by division.
And left.
Yes, they all left except that bastard brat of a Scots peddler came back. I'm sorry, he was rather difficult to take. And now that he's got his own Broadway show, he's even more difficult to take.
All right.
Self-congratulatory, isn't he?
This next question comes from Jessica, who's watching in Arlington, Virginia. And she asks, what do we know of the actual interactions of Adams and Madison? Were they this lively?
Let's first acknowledge the compliment we just got.
Right.
That amazing compliment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
They don't seem to have, we don't have a record of them meeting like this.
No.
We don't have a record of them conversing. I've not seen letters between them. We tend to see references to them in the third person. For example, Jefferson writes to Madison about Adams, and he quotes Franklin's characterization of him, but he then says, "Oh, he is disinterested as the being that made him, and I pronounce that if you ever meet him, you shall come to love him as I do." And Madison benefits from Adams. At one point in the retirement correspondence, Adams says of Madison, Mr. Madison's presidency has collected, and justifiably so, more honor than his 3 predecessors put together. And by the way, that's Washington, Adams, and Jefferson. So Adams is dissing himself and Jefferson and George in favor of Madison. So it's interesting. What we're doing is a sort of conjectural what might have happened had we put the two of them together. We do know that Adams loved to argue. Oh, did he love to argue. And he loved to converse. And we know that he argued bitterly and vehemently with Thomas Paine. We know that his confrontations with Hamilton got to the point that each man concluded by thinking the other absolutely mad. And actually, one of the features of the Paul Giamatti HBO John Adams miniseries that I deeply loved was the interaction between Paul Giamatti as John Adams and Stephen Delane as Thomas Jefferson. Because it was wonderful. The two men really did their homework and really studied what they were doing and really got the personal dynamic right between them.
They didn't get Jefferson right.
I thought they got
No.
Jefferson right. That was the man I wrote about.
Jefferson is portrayed as English. He speaks with a slight, he's an English actor.
No, he's Irish.
He speaks
Which is
with-
weird. Jefferson's
Yeah.
ancestry was Welsh.
Welsh, but he speaks with a British inflected accent. He's always dressed to the nines in the show.
Well, Jefferson was dressed to the nines.
No, he's
Look,
much more casual.
that's deliberate. That's the 1790
Of course.
appearance
Yeah.
before the Senate. Jefferson shows up to testify before the Senate, and one of the senators, William McClay, notes that his clothing doesn't quite fit right, it's kind of slipshod, he doesn't know how to sit properly, he doesn't have good posture. But what Jefferson was doing by that, in the politics of self-presentation, so common in the period, and I'm getting this from Joanne Freeman's great book, Affairs of Honor. It's not mine. I wish it were. Jefferson's dressing and carrying himself that way as a silent, disapproving critique of the foppish, aristocratical behavior and dress and demeanor of what one historian called the First Republican Court. But later on, there's one other incident when a British minister, Thomas Merry, comes to the White House and Jefferson receives him in a bathrobe and carpet slippers. And Jefferson is doing that because Merry's clad in full diplomatic regalia, complete with a ceremonial sword by his side. And Jefferson's basically telling Thomas Merry, I'm sorry, pal, we don't do it that way here. It's like Fidel Castro receiving a diplomat in his fatigues. It's not necessarily his actual sartorial preference. It's more likely his political statement with his clothing.
So is it not better, Mr. Adams, that a president should affect, as indeed he was, the common man rather than affect the aristocratic demeanor that Mr. Adams is
Well, if he can afford it. I got criticism because I kept wearing all the clothing I had, which was only the clothing I had when I represented the United States as first American minister to Great Britain. Not an ambassador, mind you. That's an aristocratical title that doesn't come until the 1880s, a century afterward. And I wrote to a friend bitterly, I am being reproved for wearing my old aristocratical fine clothing because I cannot afford to buy a set of new Republican plain clothing. Is that fair? I'm sure even you would say it's not fair.
I would recall, if I may use your crystal ball of clairvoyance, a famous American president who talked about his cloth coat.
I don't think you want to bring that president up.
A notable vice president, too.
I don't think you want to bring him up. He is not a good exemplar.
I certainly don't, nor his vice president.
Oh, God, no.
All right, so we've got about 10 minutes left for questions, so we're going to try to do some rapid-fire question and answer.
What would either of you guys, if you were around today, think about the candidates that are running for president this coming year?
Well, I believe there's an old Latin term called oy vey.
Yes, but I would add, because one of our learned colleagues, Jack Rakove, said that John Adams would never use one word when five well-chosen substitutes would do. Oy vey es mir. Gewalt. Which means, oh my God, help. And that really is all I can say. I was just
Well, the style of
Speechless.
politics is so different now. The notion of quote-unquote running for office is anathema to us in our 18th century sensibility. We stand for office. We don't run for office. It wasn't until that Jackson and then
Yes.
Van Buren fellow campaigned and pandered to the electorate and said whatever he felt they wanted to hear.
I will say
Altogether.
this, though. There was an aristocrat on that stage, very wealthy, could not tire of telling us how wealthy he was, and how effective he would be, and how everything he did would be great, and how everything that's happened before him is a disaster, a catastrophe, horrible, and so forth. And this is what you get when you ignore the dangers of aristocracy.
For a man who would be king.
A man, well, you get a man who would be king.
But
I would not be king. You mistake me.
Nor would I, nor would any except those who want to fortify the executive branch to such an extent.
Overreaching, Mr. Madison.
I think we might call it that.
Did the Founding Fathers continuously look to Britain as their model? I know you mentioned that. Or did they look to the Netherlands or any of the other European nations when they were creating the Constitution?
No, politics were so polarized that you couldn't look to either. If you looked to Britain, you were a Federalist or Tory. If you looked to France, if you were a Republican like Jefferson, you looked to Paris and to France for what was going on there.
Well, that's after the French Revolution.
Well,
In the 1770s and 80s, I think this is what I would say, and now I'm channeling my old mentor, Henry Steele Commager, who I still delight to honor. Basically, what you see in the thinking of all the founding guys was that all of human knowledge and wisdom and experience was coming together like the tributaries that form the Mississippi or the Nile or the Rhine or the Seine or the Thames into a great confluence.
a newly named confluence.
And from what?
A new and newly named confluence.
I'll accept that for now. And the key thing is to take that confluence and distill from it general principles of human nature, society, politics, and government. So sometimes, yes, they would look to Great Britain. Sometimes, no. Sometimes they would look to France for some things and not for other things. They were putting things together. It was a smorgasbord approach, if you will. But they really believed everything was coming together. Everything. Their own experience, the experience of other nations, past and present. And they were conducting a profound and difficult argument between past and present about the future. So that's my answer.
And I think, if your question could be extended to foreign policy, we see it there too. There's a real, quite what we call realpolitik here, where Jefferson, who despised the British, when he thought that Napoleon would be taking over the Louisiana territories, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet. This is heresy for him to say. But it was realpolitik, it was realistic global politics that he had to decide. I was sorry, an interview visit in Baltimore, the USS Constitution, or Constellation is there.
Boston
Not
is
Old
the
Ironside,
Constitution.
but in Baltimore. And I'm sure it's the same at Old Ironsides. You look at the cannons on these two men of war, they have the British Royal Seal on them. Why? Well, because they had to buy them from the British. Only the British could cast cannon of that size. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend in global politics, and I think they were smart enough to at least recognize that.
This is our last question of the night, which comes from Dr. Kilt, who asks, can you each give a quick summation of the careers of these two men?
Well, I'm trying to write a concise biography of John Adams. I'll go first and do this really fast. Born in 1735 to his father, John Adams, a farmer, a shoemaker, and a deacon of his local church, and his mother, Susanna Boylston Adams. Educated in schools in Braintree and then at Harvard College, becomes a lawyer, practices extensively and successfully, marries Abigail Smith, the daughter of a local clergyman, brilliant woman, one of the most brilliant of her generation, gets involved in the political brawls against British rule, eventually rises to the national level of serving in both the First and Second Continental Congresses, serves on the committee that frames the Declaration of Independence, also frames the resolution for Congress urging states to make new constitutions, and writes a how-to-do-it guide known as Thoughts on Government, which is still worth reading, and I wish you would all read it. Becomes an American diplomat with intermittent success, not so good in France, great in the Netherlands. Eventually becomes American minister to Great Britain, tries to influence the adoption of the Constitution from overseas with no real success, is chosen Vice President of the United States, suffers horribly in that job for 8 years, succeeds George Washington as president, beating Thomas Jefferson, who becomes his vice president, suffers horribly through that job for 4 years, defeated for re-election, appoints John Marshall Chief Justice, retires to Braintree, and spends the last 25 years of his life in scolding, dogmatism, and delight, which I think is his own phrase, and ends as a great sage, one of the sages of the Revolution, and dies on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence at the age of 90, universally lamented. How's that?
Very well done, and a distinguished and honorable career.
I tried.
Yeah. Madison has a different trajectory. Madison is born to the second wealthiest plantation owner in Orange County, Virginia. But his uncle was the head of the Anglican Church, also called James Madison. It's often some confusing. James Madison, always, till well into his life, signed his name James Madison Jr. To distinguish himself from his father. And here's a difference that I think may explain a lot of the differences we're having here today. It's their education as well. John Adams went to Harvard. He followed...
Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that.
You went there.
Well, we all have our mistakes at times. But, it was wonderful. But there he got a very traditional classical education. James Madison went to Princeton. Also, not known as Princeton at the time, but College of New Jersey, which was a very different curriculum. It was Scottish influenced, not classically influenced. And this meant that the Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, called common sense philosophy, which emphasized the inherent, if not goodness of mankind, but a certain basic faculty of choosing between right and wrong in the individual, very influential to Jefferson as well. So Madison had a very different upbringing intellectually, and I think this led him into the Scots view of politics, and I think some of this extended republic idea does have some Scottish tinge to it as well, the notion of how you put together remember, Scotland and England are joined as the United Kingdom, and the Scots hated this. The English were a majority in Parliament under a Walpolean party that kept an unshakable majority through much of the 18th century and basically screwed the Scots out of everything. The Scots weren't even allowed to have their own militia at the time, which is one source of the Second Amendment, that we should have, that no majority should deny a majority unit of the public sphere a militia. But he then he's a technical wizard. And his personality, also the fact that we still don't know exactly what it was, but we suspect it was epilepsy, a variety of epilepsy that made him very, very shy about speaking in public. He was always afraid that he would have a fit in public and be thrown into, at the time, were the inhuman conditions of a mental hospital, locked up and the key thrown away. So he works behind the scenes. He's a wizard as the majority leader in Congress at the first Congress. And it is he who brings the Bill of Rights through Congress. It is he who brings the Bill of Rights, shaping it as it became. It is he who really, I think, leads, more so than Jefferson, the creation of the first opposition political party in the United States to oppose Alexander Hamilton's Walpolean unified what he wanted to be as a corrupted parliamentary majority. So Madison has a different trajectory than Adams, and I think contrary, I'd be interested in your view of how Adams looked at the American experiment in the last decade or two of his life. Madison died a very unhappy man, He was really badly disappointed in the trajectory of American politics at this time. And died, as I say, a very wonderful book by Drew McCoy on the last of the fathers. I mean, where he shows how someone saw this experiment go in different directions. So that's how I would sum it up. He's a technician. He's a constitutionalist, a political person in a way that Adams never could be. So he did not really succeed. I don't think he was a great president either, for that matter.
There are two things about what David has said that I'd like to expand on for just a minute. One, actually, I've written about this and said James Madison is a consummate political technologist. He is obsessed with political technology and devising new political technology to respond to new problems. I get that term from Morton White's great book, Philosophy.
Let's hear the
The
word
Federalist
new
and the
in there a couple
Constitution.
times, right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Adams is the first great comparative government guy, the comparative student of government. That's a field in political science now. Back home at CCNY, I have to make sure as departmental advisor that all my students take at least one course in comparative government. I try. But the key thing is this. The outlooks of a political scientist who does comparative political science and a political technologist are profoundly different. And then there's one other difference that separates Adams from Madison, which I think is why Madison becomes almost obsessed with the extended republic model, and Adams is not even thinking about it. Adams misses arguments over federalism. He's not there. The arguments over federalism start in the late 70s and persist throughout the 80s, and Adams is in Europe. He's not home. Madison's in the Confederation Congress. Also, Madison's in the Virginia State Legislature when he's not in the Confederation Congress. And holding Virginia together is only slightly less difficult than holding the Union together. So Madison has almost a forced flash course in federalism, and extended republic theory and extended republic practice. Now, both men were influenced to some degree by Scottish common sense philosophy. One of the books that most influences John Adams is Adam Smith's great, wonderful book, which I urge you all to read, Not the Wealth of Nations, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, his first book, which he then returns to and revises just before he dies in 1790. Adams loves that book. So Adams and Madison are both influenced by the Scottish philosophers. Madison, by the way, gets a lot of his ideas about the extended republic from the political essays of David Hume, as Douglas Adair showed about half a century ago. But the key thing is this. Both men are influenced by the same body of thought, but in different ways.
Yeah,
and I think it's based on their experience and their political priorities.
Yeah, I don't want to make this too polemic, but I think what distinguishes Madison in a way that makes him more significant than Adams is that the great constitutional questions that were faced all through our history, even to this day, have to do with federalism, really. What is the relationship between the states and the federal government? And Adams, that was a blind spot.
Yeah, no,
for
he
Adams.
doesn't get that. I'm going to say that in the conclusion to my biography. On the other hand, someone I used to know was reading my draft of my conclusion of the book, and she then said to me, so is Adams the political theorist of the 99%? Because he criticizes aristocracy, he warns against aristocracy, he tries to set up ways to limit aristocracy. Is he... I'm going to change it. Is he Bernie Sanders in 1790? I said, not quite. But I did discover something really amazing. There was a famous radical political sociologist named C. Wright Mills. And in his book, The Power Elite, who does he quote 8 times with amazing respect and at length? John Adams. Because C. Wright Mills says John Adams saw it first. And who else? The political commentator Kevin Phillips, in one of his recent books about political elites and what he calls the Bush dynasty, but he goes further. The last chapter, he says, the one founding father we're all ignoring and we all should be listening to is John Adams, because Adams was warning us against aristocracy. So it may well be that although certain central issues, the other issues, the issue of slavery, which Adams doesn't touch, and race, which Adams doesn't address, except in a few fleeting comments to Jefferson, but
Adams was probably more racist than Jefferson in many respects.
I don't know about that.
No, I mean, the Adams family was
Okay, we're
quite, I mean, they used the N-word all the time. Jefferson never did.
Okay.
So,
So there you have it. One last slap at John Adams.
Maybe not the last one. Now we'll move into our concluding remarks, starting with hashtag Team Adams, then hashtag Team Jefferson, just to finish out the night.
What, in the end, does John Adams stand for? John Adams stands for the idea that the political wisdom of the ages is a resource that should not simply be thrown away because it is not new. That does not mean that Adams would not be open to ideas that are new. One of my great regrets is that we don't have evidence of this kind of dialogue between Adams and Madison. It might have helped both men. It might have taught both men something. Still, in his faith in constitutionalism, in his attempts to guide his countrymen on how to frame a constitution, both by that amazing pamphlet, Thoughts on Government, and his own Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 as a great exemplar and model for the U.S. Constitution, and his unremitting commitment to public service, even when it cost him and his family an extraordinary amount, John Adams has a lot to teach us. And now at the end, many of the founding guys, not just James Madison and not just Thomas Jefferson, but virtually all of them, look with some degree of despair and sadness on the future. This is not what we thought we were going to get. This is not what we thought we were going to have. I read John Adams' letters in the last decade of his life, and I see a man who's basically reconciled to the knowledge that his countrymen may go their own way, and, well, they're governing themselves, and that's what you're going to get. So fine, I wish them well. I wish them well. I may not agree with what they're doing. I may not like it. I may try to counsel them otherwise, but I wish them well because they're taking on this task. I'm writing, as I say, a book about John Adams, and I was telling David I'm going to write 2 more before I'm done. A short biography, then a big book on his presidency, and then maybe a big comprehensive full biography. It's a privilege and a pleasure to spend time with him. He's a remarkable man. He shows us his inner well springs of his human nature more than any of the other founding guys. He is more self-revealing, more honest, more self-critical. And there's one other quality of John Adams that I sort of tried to bring out tonight when I channeled him, but I'm not sure I did it as well as I could have, and that's his sense of humor. That's one of the things that you love when you read John Adams. And it comes out best when you read the second volume of the Adams-Jefferson letters, the volume that collects the letters that Adams and Jefferson exchanged when they were old men. And Adams had this amazing sense of humor about himself, about humanity, about the American experiment, and he never lost it. In fact, it's one of the great tributes to John Adams that he not only hung on to it, but he expressed it so well. I'll leave you with this thought. The founding guys had one last task before them as old men, except for poor Alexander Hamilton, who never got to be an old man because of Aaron Burr. Sorry. They had to explain themselves to posterity. They had to try to shape how posterity understood them and the history they had made. There's one last quote I'll give you from John Adams. He writes it to Jefferson, and I was tempted but never quite got to use it with David tonight. You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to one another. And that's one of the great things about John Adams. He keeps explaining himself to us because he wants us to listen, he wants us to learn, and he thinks we can do it. Thank you.
Mr. Adams expresses his feelings in eloquent ways. It is a shame that Mr. Madison, who's, as I say, who's probably the most private of the founders, given his fears of his malady being discovered, built these firewalls of secrecy around himself. But I would submit that the new science of politics is, and one more point about Mr. Adams, I believe the Massachusetts Constitution is the only one that requires good humor on the part of its political leaders.
Yes.
New Hampshire copied it almost verbatim and took out good humor. Go figure. But I think the issue, I'll try to be very brief on this with the new science of politics, is how to balance the interests of the locality with the greater good. How is the greater good to be achieved when we are a diverse population, a population spread out now over thousands of miles, a population that became a magnet called the best poor man's country that has attracted poor, to bring the poor from all over the world to the United States. But to recognize and acknowledge not just the inherent passion and self-interest of the individual, but the need to turn that almost like judo, to take the force of a negative of your opponent and turn it into a positive, to take this variegated political, social, religious community and to promote variety, to promote diversity, to promote freedom of the will and freedom of the mind, not to have it imposed by some central power, whether that power be in a far-off national capital or whether it be in the state capital. Remember Madison's mobilization against the political vices of the time. He wrote a pamphlet called Vices of Our Political System, and he was talking about the states. The states were chaotic. The states would have these elections every year. They would pass one law and then repeal it the next. Then they would screw over one part of the population and then another would gain a temporary majority in it. This is what he is trying to deal with. And by spreading these forces out and setting them against one another in a much bigger arena of competition, the idea is to dissipate and reach the higher good. Ultimately, and this I think is what the great problem is, that he has never solved, and because it was new, and I think this is the question of federalism, what was called imperium in imperio. How do you have one political unit inside of another political unit and recognize the authority of both of those political units? This was the great conundrum in politics in the 18th century. This was the great paradox. How do we do this? And I think it's this question of federalism, which he tried to solve by creating what he called a government which is both national and federal, in which these forces and these variegated competing passions and special interests would counteract one another in this quest for the common good that could only be achieved in a large political unit where it was recognized. Federalism is our great constitutional question. It's before the court now. It's before the court with regard to Kentucky and Rowan County. It is before the courts with regard to many, many things. And it's Madison's effort to create or to confront the novelty of this political issue, I think, that should give us all some faith in confronting, grabbing the nettle, and trying to come up with creative solutions. Thank you.
Thank you both very much for everything that you shared with us this evening. And thank you all for coming to participate in this exciting debate. Those here in the audience, please take this moment to fill out your ballots and drop them off as you leave this evening. Those watching online, feel free to now tweet your vote to @ULMCenter using either #Adams or #Madison. The winner of tonight's debate will be reminded that they have the chance to duel Alexander Hamilton a year from now. Teacher scholars, please meet Ben Geese outside after we're finished. And we invite everyone back, either virtually or with us here in the Chow Auditorium on October 8th, when we hear Dr. Lorraine Foote discuss a United States soldier who was held as a prisoner of war by the Confederate States of America, who escaped his captivity January of 1866. And that's on October 8th here in the Chow Auditorium. Thank you all for coming and have a great rest of your night.